to you about menstruation and the stigmas around it. And it may be a little uncomfortable, but what better place to have this conversation than on the red dot? If you've ever felt like you don't know a lot about periods, I want to tell you, you're not alone. If you've ever been afraid to talk about menstruation, me too. I'm even scared to talk about it now. But actually, there's a reason that we feel this way, and it's not just a personal one. We're taught from a young age to fear periods and to feel ashamed of them. Women especially are taught not to discuss their reproductive health. Where boys engage in a you show yours and I'll show mine kind of self-disclosure, girls are socialized with a don't ask, don't tell mindset about sexuality, reproduction, and womanhood in general. As a society, we don't talk about periods. We don't talk about feminine reproductive health. We don't talk about women's natural and healthy bodily functions. And we don't talk about why we don't talk about these things. So, for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about the history of stigmas around menstruation and how they're still affecting us in our current day. It's important to talk about this stuff so that we know the harmful history we're perpetuating when we minimize and stigmatize menstruation. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the non-binary and transgender people that may or may not experience menstruation. Their stories are just as important as cisgendered people, but there's a lack of academic knowledge, research, and history about them in regards to menstruation. So this talk will focus more on the cisgendered aspects of menstruation that have largely defined our society. Just kidding, sorry. We know having a period is natural for many people, but we treat it as if it's something shameful to be hidden away and feared. We've come to define ourselves as a society, our humanity, we've come to define it by only the functions and experiences of men. This ideology is harmful to us all because it limits us and our potential achievements. In order to create a more equal society, we have to acknowledge all people, all bodies, and all of the amazing things they're capable of. As a sociologist, I care deeply about the shame and fear that we perpetuate onto one another as a society, because this shame and fear is part of what makes us. It's also what we can address to improve our personal lives and our collective experience. Now, when we talk about stigmas, we know that a stigma is a marker that sets a person or a group apart from the rest of society. Stigmas can include criminal actions, abnormal behaviors, and even identifiers beyond our control. People believe that the origins of the stigma around menstruation are ancient. Up until the 19th century, people didn't understand how someone could bleed for a week every month without being injured. This led men to the belief that women were cursed or somehow magical and began the stigma. But the stigma has continued despite these primitive residual fears having been addressed by medical advancements and research. But let's talk about some of the specifics of these stigmas now. Aristotle, one of the great Greek philosophers and influencers of our Western society, literally referred to women as mutilated men and called them monsters, deviated from the generic human type. Now, what was his logic for these kinds of drastic statements? Menstruation. Okay. His rhetoric has passed on, it's continued throughout society, and it's made room for a particular kind of misogyny and demonization or dismissal of women that we can still see today. When I was growing up, a very common insult was to ask people, boys and girls, if their bad mood or distress over something was because they were on their period. For example, if a boy didn't want to hang out with his friend after school, his friend would then ask, "Why? Are you on your period?" He used this question to make the first student reestablish his masculinity by doing what he had originally declined to do. This example shows us how menstruation is weaponized as a tool to shame and fear people, and it also shows us how femininity is disparaged to empower and reinforce masculinity. This mentality of using menstruation as an insult must stop if we're moving towards a more equal society. If we look at religion, we can see a very similar vein of stigma against menstruation. Old Jewish tradition said that those who were menstruating must be quarantined in a special area, designated area called the House of Impure Women. Now, the reasons listed for this quarantine were that there's a curse in their words and breath that others could catch, only while they were menstruating, though. That their bare feet were impure to walk on the ground, and that a child conceived during menstruation, which we now know is impossible, would be demonic, monstrous, and cursed. And other religions had similar rules and restrictions as well. Islamic belief prevents women from holding a Quran in their hands or doing their daily prayers while menstruating and forbids them from having sex as well. And if we look at Christianity, the story of Adam and Eve is all we really need to know to identify some very harmful stigmas about menstruation. Eve is the one that's responsible for their banishment from the garden. Menstruation is labeled as her punishment for this action and as a marker of her fall from grace. Eve was the creator of original sin, so we are told. And this scapegoating of women as sinful, untrustworthy, conniving still continues today. In fact, many people argue that they wouldn't feel safe with a woman as president because of her unpredictability at that time of the month. A 2010 study of Twitter shows us the language that people use to talk about menstruation by studying tweets with the phrase, "that time of the month" in them. Now, these tweets range from dismissing people's emotions as being that time of the month for them, to actually expressing anger and violence towards menstruating women because of their lack of sexual appeal for men. This is something especially that we need to talk about because it shows us how much of women's value is placed only in things that make them appealing and useful to men. We see it all the time. People will refer to a woman's looks as the first thing. These are the first terms that we use and hear to describe women. Men will call a woman sexy before they call her smart, kind, or ambitious. Women's looks also determine the level of respect they're given in society as well. If a woman is deemed unattractive, she's typically listened to less, she's referred to in derogatory terms, and she often has less close connections and relationships than a stereotypically attractive woman. This is a concept that sociologists know as social desirability, and there are many studies about it. But the mentality that social desirability standards foster is so harmful, and it must be addressed for our society to move forward. A woman's value is exponentially greater than her beauty or her use to men. Now, if we look at another field of stigmas against menstruation, we can look at the medical field. Up until even 100 years ago, doctors argued that women shouldn't go to school because the blood in their bodies would cycle up to their brains to learn instead of down to their uterus to menstruate. They argued that this change of blood flow could lead to women being unable to reproduce, or worst case scenario is death. This distanced the people that had experiential knowledge about menstruation from learning more about it. The Doctors' Board in London forbade women from becoming physicians because they wouldn't be able to bear the physical and mental burdens of the job due to menstruation. This closed the door to women doing more research about reproductive health that would have been vital in creating a better environment for us today. This lack of research is also directly linked to the stigmas around menstruation. Studies show that people don't want to learn about something that's so stigmatized in society. On top of this, studies also show that many male psychotherapists are uncomfortable discussing issues of menstruation with their clients. Even when this is a topic of discussion that their clients would like to have, many professionals shy away from it. This history of stigma is still harming us in very tangible ways in our current society. These stigmas that I've covered have led to the culture that we have today. Instead of some Native American tribes like the Hoopa, which celebrate the menses in an elaborate and beautiful ceremony, We teach people to shame it and hide it. In fact, many people who menstruate agree that one of the main concerns of it is hiding their menstruation from others. People who menstruate often refer to getting their period as a curse or something they dread and avoid. Having a period is something that's natural and that many women resonate with, but it is not the marker of a woman. It is the marker of a human. We cannot continue to define our entire species by only the functions and experiences of men. I believe if we are able to embrace periods and talk about them openly, we can move towards a far more equal society that listens to and addresses women and their issues much more holistically. The first step to healing and growing as a culture is knowing the origins of this stigma. Once we're able to know this history and debunk these harmful stereotypes, we can move forward as a society. We can learn to accept and even love the process that menstruating bodies go through. We can build a society with more equality and less shame and stigma. Thank you.